Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Generating Transformative Results with a Global Category Strategy, presented jointly by GEP and the Hackett Group. Before we get started, I would like to walk you through some of the functionalities of the On24 console. Within your console, you will find several windows and tabs you can move and expand to access our speakers' bios, view the slides for today's presentation, submit your questions, and view additional resources for today's presentation. Please note that all lines are muted, so you can submit your questions using the Q&A box, which will be addressed at the end of the presentation if time permits. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a yellow question mark icon where you can see some of the common technical issues and how to resolve them. Lastly, the on-demand version of today's webcast will be available within 24 hours after the webcast and can be accessed using the same audience link provided at registration. And now for the presentation, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We're joined today by Kurt Albertson, Principal of Procurement Advisory at the Hackett Group, and by Biju Mohan, Vice President of Consulting at GEP. Between the two of them, they have several decades worth of experience advising global clients regarding strategic direction and best practices in sourcing and procurement. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Biju Mohan. Biju?
Thanks, Melissa. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. I look forward to a great session today where we can share our expertise and knowledge with all of you. A bit about myself. I am a Vice President of Consulting with GEP, based in New Jersey, office of GEP. I have been working on multiple areas in supply chain and procurement across regions in the US, Europe, and Asia, across industries, CPG, pharma, manufacturing, and retail. With more than 18 years of experience, I have worked on specific areas where we have worked on category management setup, category strategy development and implementation, and driving greater results through the implementation of these category strategies. I look forward to sharing my expertise and experience in this area with you today in this webinar session. Let me hand it over to Kurt to introduce himself.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. This is Kurt Albertson. I'm a principal with the Hackett Group, and in the role, I've been at the Hackett Group for 13 years now. Prior to that, I spent 7 years in as a management consultant in the sourcing and procurement space, and prior to that, I was in the automotive industry for 4 years in a manufacturing environment. In my role today at the Hackett Group, I manage our North American procurement advisory practice, which has about 200 plus clients that our advisory team works with, extending best practices from our research and experiences in working with other clients. So look forward to talking to you today about some of the latest results from our global category management study. Biju?
Thank you, Kurt. Before we start, I wanted to give a bit of an overview about who we are in GEP. GEP is a recognized global leader in all procurement and supply chain solutions. We have a service offering as well as technology suite, which addresses different areas of procurement technology and services. In the case of procurement, we provide consulting services addressing strategy development, supporting organizations to transform their procurement functions, and developing and implementing insightful recommendations which will help them generate savings and value across categories in the both direct and indirect space. In the technology side, we have a solution of smart tools which are covering all the end-to-end procurement-related areas, including spend technology, PR to PO, and contracts and market intelligence services. In addition to all this, we have a global practice which addresses different category-specific areas as well as industry-specific areas. With more than 200 clients globally, we have about 14 offices and delivery centers with more than 2,500 people across these offices supporting multiple clients. Our client presence is across 20 industries, and we have more than 200 clients working with us in terms of driving spend and procurement efficiencies. Just to give a brief snapshot, our service is unique in the sense that we have a combined offering of consulting services, managed services, as a solution of procurement software. Together, we are able to provide a one-stop shop which supports all organizations across their procurement and supply chain needs. This has been translated into greater value because of the single point of contact structure, increased visibility on an end-to-end basis, and providing more value in terms of reduced operating costs, higher savings, and higher efficiencies across all procurement and supply chain operations. Just wanted to give you a brief overview of that, and with that, I hand it over to Kurt to take you through the rest of the topics that you want to talk about.
Great, thank you, Bijou. So again, this is Kurt Albertson with the Hackett Group. Let me start just by giving you a little bit of background of who the Hackett Group is, just so you know where some of the insights that I'll be sharing with you are coming from. So the Hackett Group, our roots are in benchmarking. So we do a lot of studies, we do a lot of benchmarking of organizations across the G&A functions, including procurement. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some of that benchmark data today. Again, I manage our North American procurement practice and our advisory practices, and then we also have some consulting capabilities around business transformation and technology enablement. But the insights today are going to be coming from our benchmarking and studies that we do, as well as collective insights from our consulting and advisory practices. So let me kind of kick it off just by giving you a perspective of why we went down this path and really looked at this topic of how spend should be managed from a global perspective. We were getting a lot of questions from our clients on areas like how and where is spend managed most effectively across the enterprise. Should it be managed globally? Should it be managed regionally? Should it be managed locally within the facilities? We had some insights into that, but as Hackett is a very empirically based organization, we wanted to dive down into that and collect some data on that. The other questions we were getting was, how do savings and sourcing cycle times vary by the different spend management approaches? And I'll talk a little bit more about those different spend management approaches here and define those here in a couple of slides. But traditionally, Hackett's benchmarking has looked at, the time it takes to source and put in place contracts, and we've looked at savings, but we've done so in aggregate, not really by the different spend management approaches. So the study gave us ability to dive down into more detail around those areas. Other questions: how much spend do organizations typically manage through the various spend management approaches? And what criteria should they be looking at to identify the optimal approach? So, for example, how much spend do organizations manage through things like tactical sourcing capabilities? How much spend do they typically manage through global category management approaches, and so forth? So we'll take a look at some of that data. And then finally, and very importantly, a lot of our clients were struggling with how, they wanted to manage spend more globally to drive greater value, but they were struggling with some of the practices to be able to do that successfully. So we also took a look at that. So look forward to spending the next 35 minutes or so with you, sharing you some of these insights and answers to some of these questions. So let me just start by kind of at a high level talking about some of the key takeaways from the study. First of all, and not surprisingly, the vast majority of organizations continue to migrate towards a more center-led procurement organization. That's a trend we've seen continuing and don't expect it to shift. Certainly organizations, it is a bit of a pendulum. Organizations go back and forth on this, but the trend is dominantly towards a center-led organizational design model. Secondly, global category management approach, not surprisingly, tends to deliver the highest savings out of all the spend management approaches we looked at, and I'll share with you that data. But it also comes with a little bit of a cost, right? It takes longer, it's more complex, as we see, and typically, the local sourcing type activities, would average about 30 days compared to a global sourcing approach, which took 3 times longer, 90 days. And we'll look at that data in a few slides as well. Not surprisingly, some of the key capabilities to enabling a global approach to spend management, communication was one of the most important ones between procurement, stakeholders, and business lines. Some of the other things that were correlated with strong success was availability of analytics and alignment on objectives. And other key factors when determining a global spend management approach, so when determining how should spend be managed, and what spend should be managed globally, not surprisingly, things like size of spend, business criticality, and savings potential of particular categories tended to be the factors that would drive, drive a decision around managing from a global perspective. We also looked at some of the practices that more mature companies, when it came to global category management, were applying. And some of the ones they talked about as being critical were regional procurement leads in place to help support those strategies and the development and implementation of those strategies, common frameworks, and executive networking. And we'll see executive networking, while something that was effective in terms of helping drive global category management approaches, was something that a lot of organizations didn't do very well. We'll take a look at those in more detail here. Okay, let's take a step back and kind of look at, this is Hackett's value pyramid that those of you who have attended other Hackett presentations have probably seen this. In general, we see that procurement is constantly trying to evolve its role in the organization and become that, what we call trusted advisor. So, we start out kind of assuring supply. We focus on negotiating and getting the best price. We start to take into account, broader total cost of ownership objectives. We look at reshaping demand and requirements, and then, at the very top, we're really engaging with stakeholders as this trusted advisor to help drive change and help them drive their business objectives through the knowledge and relationships that we have with supply markets. So ultimately, most of our clients in one way, shape, or form are on a journey to kind of become that trusted advisor. And as we do that, we're able to unleash greater value, but we also need different capabilities and different tools, and certainly global category management falls into that. Not shocking for probably many of you, when we ask stakeholders their view of procurement, most of them desire procurement to play a more strategic role in the organization. So almost 60% of stakeholders said, yes, we would actually like procurement to be at the top of that value pyramid. We'd like to be able to partner with them as a valued business partner, as opposed to being more administrative gatekeeper or even negotiator and sourcing expert. But as we see in the eyes of most stakeholders, there's a pretty significant gap. That currently only less than 20% of stakeholders actually view procurement as that valued business partner, as opposed to the 60% desired. So there's a big gap there. And again, strategic category management is one of those tool sets that we can rely on, and managing spend from a global perspective is one of those approaches we can use to help improve this gap that we have today. So kind of switching over to kind of looking at the key priorities of procurement executives in 2017 and beyond. I mean, the good news is that procurement executives seem to understand this, right? When we have this objective or priority of elevating the role of procurement to this trusted advisor, and certainly we've heard that, that's a term that's been out in the market for a while. But it's really about changing the perspectives of stakeholders so that we are viewed to be more strategic. And what that allows us to do is deepen the influence that we have in these spend categories. So whether we're expanding influence across categories we're not involved in, but more importantly, which is what global category management allows us to do, is go deeper into the categories that we're currently involved and deliver more value, which is certainly what we're all trying to do. So we see the good news is we do see, while we see a gap in terms of how stakeholders perceive procurement today, the good news is most procurement executives recognize that and have, at least on their top 3 list of areas of priorities to focus, is how do we migrate up that value pyramid and elevate the role of procurement to a trusted advisor within the eyes of our stakeholders, so that we can then go out and do more complex things around these categories to drive greater value. So now we'll kind of start getting into some of the study results, right? I talked about this in the summary of most organizations really kind of rely on this center-led approach to driving procurement. Very few are still in kind of a central, completely centralized, where spend is managed primarily by a single centralized team. And slightly more are in a decentralized mode, but we continue to see them migrate to this center-led type approach for procurement. Which is good news. I mean, and what this means for us when we think about global category management, Center-led really means about a strategy set by the centralized team, but executed regionally or locally. So it doesn't mean that the center-led procurement organization does it all, but they should be orchestrating the spend management approach at a global level in terms of how we're going to do it. That strategy, that policy, what is that going to look like? And that includes, kind of identifying, okay, where do we use strategic category management? Where do we use strategic sourcing? Where do we use tactical sourcing capabilities? They need to orchestrate that, and they need to develop those policies. So when we think about the different spend management approaches that are out there are really kind of 5 that we look at. And we kind of look at this, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, this global by design, regional where necessary, and local only as absolutely necessary. So when we talk about a global category strategy, it's really about strategies that are developed with respect to the overall enterprise spend. So when we think about it, that's where we're starting the discussion. It doesn't mean that we actually end up with a single supplier across the entire global space, but we do have a strategy that encompasses the entire enterprise spend at a global level. And the tool set we use to drive that is a formal category management approach, and it's applied to the category for ongoing management of all spend within that category. The other approach is this BU regional large country sourcing approach. This is typically where we decide and make a strategic decision that we're going to manage the spend at a BU regional or large country like North America perspective. So strategies are developed with respect to a specific region, BU, and a strategic sourcing process is generally applied to manage the spend. And then, of course, we have these, we have spend that is managed from a local country sourcing strategy perspective. These are strategies that are developed and executed in support of spend within a specific country or even at a facility level. So the spend that's managed at the local level. Another approach that we're seeing a lot of organizations really focusing on is what we call tactical sourcing as a core capability. So tactical spend is spend that's managed as a one-off request, typically following a quick 3 bids and a buy process, and handled by a support center, either globally, regionally, or in many cases outsourced. So it's typically not at the local level, it's more at a regionalized or even global level from a service placement perspective. And then finally, many of us have this non-procurement managed spend that's out there, and we define that, or it's something we're trying to get more control over. A lot of times spot buy technologies, things like Amazon Business, for example, we've all heard about that in the market. So that spot buy technology is another approach we can use to get more control over some of that non-procurement managed spend. So I won't go into this slide in too much detail, but it was in the research paper that we released as a result of the study, and it just looks at some of the additional considerations for the different spend management approaches that we apply. And as I was, there's a couple of things I do want to point out. When I talk about a global category strategy from a service placement perspective, it's usually driven by category managers within either a corporate procurement organization, or it can be a person who's in a BU or region but has a lot of experience in that category. So it doesn't necessarily have to be run out of a corporate setting. And in most cases, though, it is in-sourced. These are typically not category, these global category strategies are typically not driven by outsourced providers, but in some selective cases, we may opt to use a BPO provider for some specific categories where we need expertise. But generally, these category managers are aligned by a category at a global level. When we get down to more the regional sourcing approach, they're generally aligned across categories as opposed to aligned to a category. But certainly for some of the key categories within those regions, you may have a category alignment for some of those resources. Generally, this is in-sourced with thought given to selective use of BPO providers for non-strategic categories. But certainly, again, different companies take different approaches at this. So in many cases, organizations may opt to decide that a BPO provider can more effectively manage this type of spend, and we'll partner with them to do so. When we think about local country and sourcing strategies, this is the kind of, again, the purchases that are made at the local, or in many cases, the facility level. And in their current form, they're generally insourced, but what we're also seeing is a lot of this spend within kind of at the local level is often a good candidate for the tactical sourcing approach. And generally, when we look at tactical sourcing, we're looking at tactical buyers within a region aligned across category, not necessarily aligned to a specific category. And we generally see organizations either kind of opt to build this out into their own internal global business services organization, or this is very commonly turned over to a third party to help support that type of spend. So I've thrown these terms around, two terms. I've thrown global category strategy. I've also talked a little bit about strategic sourcing, a traditional strategic sourcing approach. Let me just spend a second kind of defining how, at Hackett at least, we differentiate between these two approaches because they are very different in Hackett's vernacular. For us, a strategic category management framework is a five-step process or five-step framework that is much at a higher level than a traditional strategic sourcing approach, and I'll talk through that here. The first step is similar to a strategic sourcing step where we do category planning and segmentation. We're defining categories, we're stratifying our categories, we're aligning teams around these categories. But this is done at a much higher level than a strategic category management approach as opposed to a strategic sourcing approach. You think of a strategic category management approach, defining much broader categories that are made up of a lot of subcategories that we traditionally think as categories. The second step is to develop the category strategy, and again, that kind of parallels the strategic sourcing approach. But again, this is at a much higher level, and it's also much more forward-looking and out over the next period of 2 to 5 years, as opposed to a more shorter term, often for strategic sourcing. So it's looking at the portfolio of subcategories that make up that category over the next 2 to 5 years and figuring out what are we going to do to drive value in this broader category. Now, steps 3, 4, and 5 are where we really see the divergence from a typical strategic sourcing process. Step 3 looks at category governance. Category governance basically says, look, as a strategic category management approach, we are going to have a portfolio of initiatives that are going to be part of that make up our broader category strategy. The category governance piece basically says, how are we going to manage and govern those initiatives and make sure we drive those to completion at the initiative level, at the BU level, and at the senior executive level. So this is a structured governance process that helps us move those initiatives forward. Then we have steps 4 and 5, which are really at the initiative level, where we define category strategy execution. So it's about project plans around these different initiatives, and then it's about managing and optimizing performance and putting together business cases around these initiatives and making sure we drive that value. So this is a very different framework than a traditional strategic sourcing approach, which basically is a 5 or 7 step process, as I'm showing here. And I'm not going to go through a traditional strategic sourcing approach. Most of us know this, but the main difference is, by definition, strategic sourcing is about identifying, evaluating, negotiating, and transitioning to suppliers. So by definition, strategic sourcing is one of the initiatives it's a very frequent initiative that's part of our broader strategic category management framework, but it shouldn't be the only initiative that we leverage. So again, we look at strategic category management and strategic sourcing as 2 very different frameworks. Strategic sourcing is a value lever that is pulled as part of the strategic category management approach. I mentioned that the tactical sourcing capabilities, one of the spend management approaches, is something we often see kind of turned over to a third party to help support. In fact, it's one of the top 3 based on a recent study that we did. We see tactical sourcing, particularly for indirect materials and services. About 0.25% of organizations have kind of looked to a third party to help support and manage that spend management approach. So I also, I was talking about strategic category management. I thought it worth noting that I spend a lot of my time working with clients on helping them build out a strategic category management approach and kind of helping them, as a tool set to better manage spend at a global level, and to help them really differentiate what are the different activities that they do as opposed to a strategic sourcing approach. In reality, we kind of look at these two frameworks as bookends, right? And in reality, when we see, you see about 60% of organizations, when we ask them kind of what's their maturity around global category management, most of the organizations are still pretty immature when it comes to kind of migrating to that strategic category management approach. We see only about 7% of organizations would truly say they are leading when it comes to having implemented this, strategic category management approach as opposed to a more traditional strategic sourcing approach. So it's not something that's easy to get to, but a lot of organizations, again, are trying to build out capabilities around this framework. And this slide just kind of summarizes the differences between strategic sourcing versus strategic category management as a summary. The goal in strategic sourcing is typically reduced purchase price, whereas strategic category management is about maximizing category value, including total cost of ownership, risk, performance, revenue growth. Frequency. Strategic sourcing is generally recognized as a one-and-done type of effort that's revisited every 1 to 3 years, depending on when contracts expire. Strategic category management is an ongoing day-to-day process. Basically, as a strategic category manager, you are managing a portfolio of initiatives and strategies on an ongoing basis. Again, the approach for strategic sourcing is generally a 5 to 7 step process that culminates in transitioning to a supplier contract, whereas the approach for strategic category management is applying a broader level of value levers such as SRM, value engineering, process reengineering, compliance management, policy development, and managing those as a set of initiatives. So in the end, we create greater value, business value for our stakeholders as opposed to just primarily being focused on price cost reduction, which is certainly important. But if we want to manage spend at a global level and drive greater value, we need to start the discussion from what are the business objectives and what are the business value drivers we're trying to enable through this approach. So I talked a little bit about this when I gave the summary. So, when we think about, what is the best way to kind of manage, what's the best spend management approach we should look at? Should we manage it globally versus regionally versus locally? That was something we looked at. We looked at what are the factors that kind of determine when an organization would take a global spend management approach based on kind of the characteristics of the category. Not surprisingly, the ones on the left, we look at the size of spend, business criticality, savings potential of the category, category complexity. Those were the types of factors that would generally lead a company to say, okay, this category, as we kind of look at it, is going to be managed through a global category management approach. Whereas on the far right-hand side, things, factors such as, timeliness of need, so it was needed immediately, current approach or incumbent suppliers, regulatory, government regulations at a local level, for example, supply-based locality. Those types of factors generally, swung the pendulum the other way, right? This would generally say, all right, these types of categories need to be managed more at the local level or at a regional level. So, we thought this was insightful for organizations as they kind of think through that first step of kind of looking at their categories and their spend and understanding kind of the different approaches that they're going to use to managing that spend. So this slide is something that I was very anxious to kind of take a look at when we conducted the study. And it basically answers the question, okay, so if I have these different spend management approaches, right, I can, and Hackett's perspective, again, is global by design, regional as appropriate, and local when required. So you're always trying to move spend to be managed more from a global perspective, or at least at a regional perspective, and only manage it locally as absolutely required. How do organizations in practice tend to actually do that? What percent of their spend is actually managed at a global level? And so this answers that question, right? And we see that, 40% of on average of spend of the organizations that participated in the study were managing, 40% of their spend through a global category approach. So the premise was, okay, we're going to start and manage this category thinking about the global strategy. Now, we may end up as part of the strategy, with regional suppliers. So this isn't saying that we're going to end up with a global supplier, but it does say, okay, we're managing this to a global category manager who's putting together a global category strategy. And, if there are independent strategies at the regional level or at the local level, they are all coordinated and aligned. And then we saw 25% of spend at the regional level, 10% at the local level, 10% through tactical sourcing, and about 15% through that kind of unmanaged spend of procurement. And this correlates with a lot of the other studies we've done, our traditional procurement benchmark, for example. This correlates quite nicely when we think about kind of the amount of spend that's managed versus unmanaged from procurement perspective. The one thing I will say is when we think about kind of this local versus tactical sourced spend, what we are seeing in the market is tactical sourcing capabilities that are being built out are really targeting some of this non-procurement managed spend, so that 15%, so biting into some of that 15% of that spend, but also kind of looking at this local country sourcing strategy approach and saying where can we pull out some of that activity at the local level and put into a tactical sourcing capability. And for those of you who have followed Hackett, certainly one of our key metrics that we release into the market is savings as a percentage of spend on an annual basis for world-class and non-world-class, and then we'll get in and look at specific peer groups as well. And that was always very useful information, but what it didn't give us was the granularity based on the different approach that we're following. I think intuitively we all felt that a global category approach would be beneficial and we would drive greater value. But the study set out to kind of prove that hypothesis correct. And as you can see here, what we're looking at is kind of the average savings achieved for each of the different spend management approaches, right? So in the global category strategy approach, where we began by managing spend at a global level through a global category manager, on average, did indeed tend to drive greater savings than the other spend management approaches, and it aligns quite nicely with respect to the level of effort that we would put in and the breadth of scope that we would take, regional versus local, for example, with respect to investing more time and effort in complexity, but also on the back end of that, driving more savings as one measurable view of value being delivered. Certainly not the only value, because we're driving other business value objectives here of our stakeholders, but it's the more traditional one that a lot of times procurement is judged by. So, and quite interesting, I talked on the previous slide about a lot of the tactical sourcing capabilities that are being built out are built on the premise that some of that local spend can be pulled into a regional tactical sourcing capability, and certainly kind of some of the unmanaged spend out there today can be pulled into these tactical sourcing capabilities. And so when you look at this slide, you see a fairly similar savings amount from a tactical sourcing, local sourcing approach as well, which kind of goes to support that. And as one would expect, just another way to kind of look at the benefits of taking a global category approach. When we looked at companies with greater than 50% of their spend being managed through the global category management approach, on average, they drove about 6.2% savings, compared with companies in the other segmentation that were less than that, were only about 4.8%. So that correlate, just generally kind of again shows that the global category managed companies that practice this global by design type of mantra that Hackett preaches generally they do so for a reason, because it drives greater savings. Now I'm showing here our 2016 procurement benchmark data results for world-class procurement organizations versus non-world-class organizations, and you can see how those compare. The actual world-class organization for 2017 is actually up a bit. It's about 6.2%. And the non-world-class peer group is slightly up at about 3.32%. So you can see how those kind of compare and kind of fit into the results of this study. Another metric more on the efficiency side that certainly Hackett is well known for, in addition to kind of the cost of procurement, is the FTE associated per $1 billion of spend in procurement. This is a very common metric that our clients look at. They want to understand, how many resources should we have across the different procurement processes for, a level of activity or spend being managed. And just to give you a perspective, in 2016, our benchmarking showed about 15.5 FTEs per $1 billion of support for kind of the spend management processes. So things like what we would call sourcing execution and sourcing and supply-based strategy for kind of the average company out there. So what this study allowed us to do is to kind of look at, kind of dissect that number a little bit more and say, okay, well, how does that number really kind of allocate out across the different spend management approaches? So, okay, if we have kind of looked at our spend and said, spend needs to be managed through different approaches. We need to be flexible. We can't have a one-size-fits-all. We can't have one hammer that just, to manage all spend. We need different approaches. Mainly being global, regional, local, and tactical sourcing, then how do the resources, okay, Kurt, you told us we have, on average, companies have 15.5 FTEs or resources per billion of spend supporting those, spend management activities. How do they allocate out across those different spend management approaches? So that's what this slide attempts to answer. And as you can see, a global category strategy, usually about 3.3 resources per billion of spend. And this is the way to look at this slide is to say, if we had $1 billion of total spend and we had, let's say, 15 or so FTEs, how would those resources be allocated across the different spend management approaches? It's not $1 billion of global category strategy spend. It's not $1 billion of tactical sourcing. It's in aggregate. So, it was interesting to see that, actually the biggest area of investment in terms of resources is still kind of at that regional level, which certainly makes sense. I spend a lot of time with clients kind of designing global organizational models for them and working with them to understand how to optimize those. And certainly we see that when we have those discussions, right? You generally need people in the regions, not only to help support the global category strategies that are being developed, but then also to implement those as well and to manage that in-region spend. So that's going to be managed through that spend management approach. So it certainly makes sense to me that that's where we see the biggest investment in terms of actual FTEs is at that regional level as opposed to the global, local, or tactical sourcing level. The other aspect of this that we wanted to take a look at was, a traditional metric from an efficiency perspective that we see at Hackett is the amount of time it takes from requirements definition to contract creation. So the cycle time metric that, most of us probably get beat up on every day if we're sourcing professionals by our stakeholders. Everybody thinks we take too long. So at Hackett, in our procurement benchmark, we've always published world-class, non-world-class, cycle times for direct versus indirect metrics, but it was an average metric. So what this study also allowed us to do was really take a look at the different spend management approaches and say, okay, well, we understand Hackett that on average it's this, but obviously that's going to vary depending on the complexity and how and the spend management approach to this. So what are those numbers? And before, we never had really good granularity into that, but this study helped us do that. So, we see that, stuff that's managed more at a local level through a local sourcing kind of effort on average is about 30 days, but we see kind of the bookends being 12 days to 60 days. And we say min-max, in reality, those probably aren't min-max. They're probably lower decile and top decile. So they're kind of the tails. So between, probably 80% of the activities on local is between, 12 and 60 days, 80 to 90% of the activity, with the average being 30. And then we see that doubling when it comes to kind of a regional approach, and then tripling compared to local when we look at the global category approach. And I talked about that on one of the first slides I showed. So on average, it took about 90 days of effort from a global to go out and execute on a global category strategy, as opposed to doing a local sourcing event, which on average took about 30 days. And then you see there from kind of the regional approach was in the middle. So I think it's interesting in understanding, while yes, we can drive more savings, we do have to expect that the complexities of these different approaches increase, and that's how we're going to be able to drive the value. I've talked about tactical sourcing I may or may not have done a good job of defining exactly what that means, so I'll spend a little time here talking about it. Tactical sourcing, the definition we use is it's spend managed as a one-off request, typically following a quick 3 bids and a buy process and handled by a support center, either a global support center, a regional support center, or outsourced to a third party. Requests are generally non-reoccurring and under a certain threshold. And it's part of a formal procurement structure. It's part of a formal procurement capability that we develop and leverage. So, the question we often get, and certainly there's other attributes that would drive this, not just the spend size, but on a tactical sourcing capability, Kurt, first of all, what's the spend range? We usually see that, and so the study looked at that, and generally we found that things over $20,000 and on average less than $100,000 would be considered kind of this tactical sourcing spend. Now, certainly, word of caution on these metrics or any metrics that I'm showing you, they can vary quite a bit depending on some of the specific requirements and types of companies that we're working with. And we kind of usually will dive down into more detail in looking at these metrics. But these are the metrics in average. We also want to make sure before you apply any metric that you see, whether it's Hackett metric or any other metric, that you truly understand the metric and you're driving an apples-to-apples comparison, because quite often we'll see people pull out our metrics from the presentation, not really understand what they mean or how they're calculated, and then get in trouble trying to apply those metrics. But from a tactical sourcing perspective, if you're looking for kind of a ballpark figure, it tends to be between 20,000 and 100,000 in terms of these ad hoc type requests. But certainly I know organizations that go well above that, and I know organizations that go well below that as well from a tactical sourcing capability. But the interesting thing is, and I didn't include it in this presentation, I showed you the sourcing cycle times here for the other different approaches. I think I may have mentioned this earlier in the presentation. Tactical sourcing, usually on average, we're looking at cycle times of like 5 days. So again, it's a rapid approach to managing spend. As you saw from from one of the previous slides, typically about 10% of spend. Other research we've done puts that number between 10 and 20% of our spend would fall into this kind of tactical sourcing approach. But so it can be a decent amount of our spend, 10 to 20%, but it also can be a significant number of actual transactions, which is really what causes the impact on the efficiency of the organization, and why a lot of our clients are unable to really fully implement strategic category management, because they're kind of sidelined by focusing on some of this more tactical spend that they want to get out of. Okay, so I also talked about one of the things I said we set out to kind of uncover here in the study was to really understand, and I got this a lot from clients. A lot of our clients really struggle. They wanted to take a global category of management approach to managing spend. But a lot of them found they were just very unsuccessful at being able to do that. And it is challenging. The complexities go up exponentially as you try to manage spend at a global level for some of these more important complex categories. So we wanted to kind of take a look at what are some of those key practices that help organizations effectively implement global category management. And so as you move from left to right on this chart, the importance of the relative importance of the practice, companies told us, it was an important practice they felt for successfully executing on a global category management approach. And as you go from bottom to top, our clients told us that these were the ones that they were able to be more effective, and then they struggled with the ones kind of closer to the bottom. So things like leadership frequently networking with other business leaders to share best practices. It's something they felt was extremely important to the success of global category management approach, but it was difficult, and they weren't doing as good a job as they needed to today to really kind of drive the effectiveness of that and really impact the global category management approach, as was periodically reviewing category targets and recalibrating as requirements changes. We weren't as reactive, we weren't as agile when it came to kind of adjusting the strategies that we had developed and changing, and being aligned with changing business needs and as well as economic changes in the markets. Things we felt we did pretty well and were highly important having good spend information at a global level, something as basic as that, which a lot of our clients still struggle with. Look, we got to have good information to be able to go out and execute on these global category strategies. Categories have been profiled and documented with an appropriate level of detail and are periodically reviewed and updated. Look, we've got to go out and do the due diligence and execute on, profiling these categories. A lot of organizations still don't do that formally, or they do it and then they dust those off every couple of years, or they don't use kind of standard approaches to do that. Alignment around a clear set of formal business objectives was also critical. We can't be off in this, where we see this really impacting it, where the regions have different objectives than corporate. And it's very difficult to get aligned and drive these global categories when we have those misalignments. Certainly, I talked about communication before, and then putting in place organization that follows a practice of global by design, regional as appropriate, and local where required, that mantra that I talked about before. I'll point out one of the practices that a lot of people talk about and want, but in practice we found it really wasn't as important, and it really it wasn't a huge driver of effectiveness. Was this global category managers reporting directly to a corporate chief procurement officer? So, I think the lesson learned here is it's not so much about the direct versus indirect reporting lines, but it's about all the other best practices that we're implementing. Putting in place direct reporting into kind of global category managers who are going to drive all this isn't necessarily the solution to, that's not a silver bullet to being successful here. It takes a lot of work, and we have to look at a broader set of practices to be successful. I won't spend too much time on these slides. I've already kind of talked about them, but you can kind of take a look at them. It really looks at in more granularity, this global, regional versus local approach. Kind of looking at some of the attributes in turn. I talked before about size of spend, type of spend, complexity, business criticality being some of the main drivers of why something might be managed globally, or savings opportunity, I think I said, instead of type of spend. This slide and the next slide just go into more granularity with respect to that and talk about some of the definitions that we apply to some of these attributes that companies would use to kind of parse out the approach and decide on the different approach. I talked about regulatory, I talked about savings potential, timeliness of need, commonality of the category, those types of things. So certainly these are kind of those attributes that we would all think through when we're kind of analyzing our spend in the different categories to decide on what the best approach, our spend management approach, would be. And I wanted to just kind of leave here. This is the last kind of data slide before I kind of summarize here. We often get asked the question of the importance of technology with respect to kind of optimizing the spend management puzzle. And it's a critical enabler. Certainly technology is not always a silver bullet, but it certainly is a critical enabler. And I wanted to just kind of point out this slide from our key issue study. And I think I'm not going to read through all this, but it basically, spend management strategies can be greatly enabled through technology. And the approach, you really need to kind of think through what your overall technology approach is going to be here. And I think if you kind of look through this, you'll find that, the majority of organizations kind of get into this discussion around having, a single end-to-end source-to-pay solution versus best-in-breed approach. And there's pros and cons of each. And I think what you'll find in kind of looking through this is, the dominant amount of organizations out there really do kind of want an integrated end-to-end source-to-pay technology solution from a single solution provider. And there's a lot of benefits that go along with that. But when we look at the market today, and what this slide is telling us is we still struggle with that. So there's still a lot of gaps that we have with respect to the technology that's there to enable the various spend management approaches that we have. And the more complex we get, the more critical this is. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and we see this every day in working with our clients to help them figure out what that technology strategy needs to look like. So I'll leave you with this before I turn it back over to Bijou, but some things to consider as a result of this. Just as a takeaway as you're driving home tonight, think about this. Have we thought through, or to what level have we thought through and formalized the various spend management approaches that we apply to our spend today? Do we have a single approach? Do we have just two approaches? Or do we really have, are we agile? Do we have flexible approaches to different spend and apply different spend management capabilities to our spend based on the needs and requirements of our stakeholders and the potential value we can drive? Have we optimized the decision process for management of spend through our various approaches? So have we strategically kind of thought through those categories and those factors that would say what percent of spend should be going through the different, and what types of categories should be going through the different approaches? How does the level of spend and savings through each spend management approach compare to other organizations? A lot of us are used to looking at savings at an aggregate level, but ask yourself, the different spend management approaches, are we optimizing all of those? And how do the savings numbers we're driving compare to other organizations out there? Do we think about and have we successfully implemented a global by design, regional as appropriate, local as required spend management strategy? Or is it not something that we've been successful at really kind of pushing, or we haven't really thought in that kind of context? And then finally, for our global spend management approach, to what degree have we successfully enabled, those different practices that I showed, which are the drivers of effectiveness? Take a look at that slide and really think through to what degree have we really implemented this practice, which ultimately is important to driving the success of spend that we want to manage at a global level. So at this point, I will turn it back over to Bijou, and I want to thank you all for kind of paying attention here to the last 35 minutes as I talk through the results of this study.
Thank you, Kurt. I wanted to focus on two specific areas, continuing from what Kurt had explained on the category management approach. The first one I wanted to focus on is how do we build an effective category strategy, and where does it fit on with regard to the overall category management process? Second, I wanted to leave you with a couple of examples of real-life cases where we established a very structured and effective category strategy that not only drove business outcomes, but also helped in generating values, not just in terms of savings, but also in terms of better responses and better service levels. So, taking on the first point, in terms of category strategy development, as Kurt explained, it forms a very critical part and is different from sourcing strategy. Category strategy is very closely linked to the overall business strategy that is influenced by that specific category. In the case of direct, it's fairly straightforward, but in the case of indirect, there is a little bit of inward assessment that needs to be done in terms of what are all the functions that are going to be impacted by a specific category. For an example, capital would be an example where there would be impact on the budgeting process, there would be impact on risk, there would be impact on facilities management, and there would definitely be an impact on the engineering plans. So factoring that and working that into your category strategies is going to be very critical. In terms of the first steps that is normally done is focusing on developing a category strategy. The first step is to understand the business plan and the business strategy that's going to be affected. So what's the structure that's going to be affected? What's the plan over the next 3 to 5 years? What is the difference in the service levels, or the difference in the nature of services that are expected from external partners for those categories? These are some of the questions that needs to be answered while defining the category strategy. Parallelly, we also need to understand how is the market changing. Is there going to be a change, a consolidation of service providers? What are the kind of technology impact that's happening within that category that can be used or leveraged by the client for managing that specific area? Based on this, and based on an agreement on the desired business outcomes with the respective functions, the procurement function needs to come and develop a consolidated category strategy. Now, while the procurement function is responsible for driving the category strategy, it is important to understand that this is a joint effort, and there is going to be inputs from the functions that are going to be affected, and not just the functions, but also from support areas like HR, finance, and IT in many cases. Once we get a consolidated view, that's the category strategy, which dictates the sourcing process that will be used for executing that category strategy. And that is the traditional approach that sourcing as a process is expected to achieve. With that in mind, I wanted to share a couple of examples of how an effective category strategy can help an organization in not only driving cost savings, but also in improving the way the outcomes from a business perspective is addressed. The first example is for a capital area. For this client, this company was going through a global transformation, but as part of it, one of the focus areas was capital. Traditionally, capital was managed by engineering with very little involvement of procurement. And even within that, it was a very decentralized process. Decisions used to be driven at a site level and not even at a local or a regional level. And that used to be dictated by local considerations of required speed, the risk assessment that was needed, and the kind of specifications that needed to be achieved. Overall, in addition to that, only the greater focus was paid to large capital projects, but there was a significant number of small capital projects which were implemented almost without any oversight. Individually, these projects were small, but collectively, they were a significant amount. Globally, the spend was more than $200 million, which formed about 10% of the overall capital budget on an annual basis. So the approach here was to look at how can we come up with an approach, with a category strategy to manage these small capital projects, not impact the delivery lead time or service levels, while driving savings, while driving compliance, and at the same time, managing risks with regard to compliance requirements. So the approach that was followed was to consolidate all of this, put in a governance mechanism to drive oversight for these smaller projects, define clear decision trees, which would dictate when would these projects be executed at a site level or when would these projects be executed at a regional level. And finally, what would be the kind of mechanism that would be used to govern these capital projects? Would they be done internally? Would they be outsourced to a project management or a construction management company? Or would that be done at the discretion of the local regional stakeholders? So as a result, through this structured approach to define the management of the category for those small capital area, there was a number of benefits that were achieved. One is significant reduction in the cost, 10 to 15% almost on an average. Second is involvement of small and diverse business in many of these projects, which also was aligned to the goals of the capital company. And finally, with regard to the overall risk management, much more accountability at a site level as well as at a local level to make sure that the risks and compliance measures are put in effect. So I wanted to leave you with that example, and thanks again for sharing for listening to our expertise and our experience in this area. Now I'll be leaving it to Melissa to talk through some of the questions that have come up during these sessions.
Thank you, Biju, and this is Melissa again. I think that some of the questions have already been answered via the Q&A box by Kirk. I did have one here for you, Kirk, that I wanted to read out quickly as we're running out of time. The question reads, if the organization adopts multiple models of managing spend, should there be a different treatment of suppliers that fall in different practices, for example, global category strategy and BU sourcing strategy?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Melissa. Let me pull it up. If your organization adopts multiple models of managing spend, should there be different treatment of suppliers? Okay, yeah, I understand the question. So yeah, generally there definitely is. I mean, when you think about kind of the stratification of your suppliers with respect to at Hackett, we generally use a stratification pyramid that ties kind of to the supplier relationship management program, which has your most strategic suppliers, a very select group of suppliers at the very top, and then kind of works its way down to core, which is made up of most of your suppliers. Generally, you certainly would see some type of alignment with kind of that classification of your suppliers and the level of how you treat those suppliers as partners. There certainly would generally be an alignment with the with the spend management approach. That said, our approach generally also does take into account that you could have regional suppliers, for example, that are viewed as very strategic to the organization, and would need to be kind of in. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but there certainly is a very strong alignment, and certainly those suppliers that are generally part of global category strategies, particularly suppliers that have end up with a broad scope based on your global category strategy, there generally would be some correlation with those being your most kind of preferred suppliers that you work with, to use a word without actually defining it.
Okay. Thank you, Kurt. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today's webinar. If we have not addressed your questions, we will definitely get back to you so that we can continue that conversation. Before we close it out, I want to thank both Kurt and Biju for facilitating today's discussion. And also want to remind everyone that this presentation will soon be available for on-demand view, and you will receive the information on how to access the recording within 24 hours. So be on the lookout for that. You also will be able to access this webinar recording in the Knowledge Bank on the GEP website at www.gep.com. So from the Hackett Group and GEP, we thank you again and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.